China was in ruins after years of war. It had little industry and infrastructure, even less science and technology, had no navy, no air force, but unspeakable poverty and rampant disease. In such conditions, the leader of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, went to Stalin for negotiations. Mao wanted a treaty of alliance that would give China a face on the international stage. Today, we will analyze the history of relations between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation and will try to predict their prospects. We will start with the second half of the 20th century. The USSR emerged victorious in the Second World War, but its relations with former Western partners began to deteriorate rapidly, and the world held its breath in anticipation of a new conflict. Fortunately, there was no nuclear war then, and we know the period from the end of the 40s until the collapse of the USSR as the Cold War. China played a central role in this confrontation. The communists won the civil war then, there was no doubt that soon the country would join the socialist camp, but on what terms? At that time, the chairman of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, wanted equal relations with Moscow and criticized the Kremlin for the expansionist policy of the times of the Russian Empire. At the same time, Stalin saw the People's Republic of China as a younger brother who should treat the first socialist state of the world with respect. These contradictions intensified during Mao's visit to Moscow in 1949. Let's start with the fact that leaders' visit to another country is already a rather unconventional step for China. From time immemorial, the Celestial Empire considered itself the center of the world. Therefore, it was the Western barbarians who had to go here for an audience and not the other way around. Nevertheless, Mao made concessions, and to avoid spreading rumors about the negotiations' progress, he limited his delegation to a minimum. On the station platform, the leader of the People's Republic of China delivered an inspiring speech. Here is an excerpt from it. It will never be forgotten that the people of China received this fraternal help from the Soviet people and the Soviet government during difficult times. 10,000 years of friendship and cooperation, joint work between China and the USSR. We will remember these words. So Mao defined his position. He sought friendship and partnership with the Kremlin and demanded to be treated as an equal. Nevertheless, he was met in Moscow with a certain coldness. Even though the head of China was received at Stalin's residence in his country house, it was mild isolation for Mao. The Soviet leader kept his guest there a few days before the negotiations, showing who was the master in the house. From the memories of Soviet Lieutenant General, head of Soviet military specialist in China, Ivan Volodymyrovich Kovalyov. I was in touch with Mao, saw him every day and understood that he was upset and worried. During the next report, I told Stalin about it. He answered me. Many foreign guests came to us. Comrade Mao should not be singled out from them. Nevertheless, Mao then managed to arduously gain important preferences for the People's Republic of China in cooperation with the Soviet Union. Moscow contributed to developing key branches of Chinese industry, providing credit and trained specialists for China, but later disagreements began. Formally, their beginning coincided with the death of Stalin and the coming to power of Khrushchev. This is how the American political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote about Soviet-Chinese conflict. The American-led coalition retained its unity, whereas the senior Soviet bloc split within less than 2 decades. In part, this was due to the democratic coalition's greater flexibility, in contrast to the hierarchical and dogmatic, but also brittle character of the communist camp. America's principal vassals were also weaker than America, whereas the Soviet Union could not indefinitely treat China as a subordinate. The refusal of the USSR to help Beijing in the development of nuclear weapons and to support it during the war with India finally put an end to the partnership between the states. They openly began to oppose each other, particularly for control over the socialist countries of Europe and Indochina. In the late 1960s, a series of border conflicts even took place between the countries. The problem was that the USSR and the People's Republic of China were fighting for the same thing, for primacy among the countries of the socialist camp. Finally, the cooperation between China and the USA drew a wedge into the relations between the countries. While the People's Republic of China, with the help of Western companies, carried out capitalist reforms, the economy of the USSR was slowly but purposefully collapsing. With the collapse of the USSR, a new chapter in Russia-Chinese relations begins. Cooperation in the cultural, economic, and military spheres is developing rapidly. In 2001, they signed the Treaty of Good Neighbor Alliance and Friendly Cooperation, agreeing not to use nuclear against each other and pledging to strengthen cooperation. And now we are approaching 2014, namely the occupation of Crimea by the Russian Federation and the beginning of the war in Donbass, about which we have a separate video. The Russian economy is significantly integrated into the European market and suffers losses from sanctions, not as strong as after the invasion in February 2022, but the economic prospects were already much smaller. The solution was to increase exports to the People's Republic of China. Evidently, in response to the sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin wants to do the same by exporting unsold products to Asia. Russia falls at the feet of the People's Republic of China with its energy market and is not lowest in terms of purchasing power of the population. However, Russia depends far more on China than vice versa, which has generated concerns in Moscow. This is where the conflict arises. What will Beijing do with Moscow? Will it be a union of equals, where China will extend a helping hand, or will Xi Jinping build relations with the Kremlin exclusively on his terms because Putin has nowhere to go? Let's refer to the article of the Foreign Affairs. Different views on the future of Russia-Chinese relations are presented here. For example, Georgetown University professor said that the alignment is based on a common vision of global politics, common material interests and common values. This will endure especially as United States-Chinese ties deteriorate. Thus, the Russo-Ukraine war challenges the entire current system of international relations, which was based on the role of the United States of America as the world gendarme. The system that exists now is a role dominated by Western countries. Accordingly, this regime gives them advantage and forces other countries to adapt to the system. Russia is trying to shake these foundations. Russia conducts recon by fire, which China certainly look at with interest. Beijing has Taiwan, which it wants to return to, and the current aggravation of relations where the island does not contribute to a peaceful resolution of this conflict, so it is learning from the mistakes of its Western neighbor. Theoretically, this could even develop into confrontation between blocs of democratic states, supporters of the current system, and rebel dictatorships such as the Russian Federation, Iran, China, North Korea, etc. Why could it? Russian venture does not look like a victory. Maybe someone has doubts about its finale, but it is a protracted skirmish with a lot of costs. The Kremlin itself did not intend this war to be protracted and continues only because it cannot retreat. This argument destroyed the theory that the Russia-Ukraine war is a demonstration of the system of dictatorships against the system of democracies. Rather, it is an unsuccessful attempt by Putin to seize Ukraine. This raises doubts about the extent to which Beijing and Moscow are bound by a common ideology. Even if during the meeting in February 2022, Xi and Putin planned to coordinate their actions, the Kremlin definitely could not foresee what it could turn into.
Greetings, Sergey Lavrov.
Yeah.
So, here is the plan. On February 24, we will be near Kiev, but then we will suddenly leave. I want there to be, some intrigue. Then we will kill 20 our divisions, sunk our cruiser, and complete our plan for prolonging this war. Understand? And as Chinese proverbs say, I know you love proverbs. We will sit on the bank of Yangtze River and just wait for the corpse of the United States to float by it. Oh, so, what do you think about our plan, Mr. Xi?
Concerning the background, it is quite difficult to talk about a joint plan between Beijing and Moscow to diminish Western domination. The beginning was unsuccessful, and such conflicts are not resolved by improvisation. So what, a partnership or just an alliance? And why does China need to help Moscow? Okay, let's start with the desire of Beijing to put the nose of the USA out of joint, but the war is being waged against Ukraine, and one of China's main trading partners, Europe, is suffering from it. The poorer it will be, the worse will be the purchasing power of its population, and in recent decades, Beijing has gained strength due to market expansions, not military advantages. And at the Silk Road project, China is investing in bridges, port facilities, railroads and roads around the world. Beijing is spending several hundred billion euros on what it calls the Silk Road economic belt. And now Putin unleashes a war and this project becomes frozen. Isn't Xi losing too much for the Kremlin to show Washington who is in charge? A scenario where Beijing's attitude toward the Russian Federation will be based solely on cold calculation seems much more likely to us. No matter how terrible the war was, for Xi, the Russia-Ukraine war is a distant conflict, kind of out of poker. The Russian Federation staked the lion's share of its resources, and Ukraine was forced to stake everything it had. Beijing, on the other hand, can follow the emotions of the players, the situation at the front, and withhold or raise the bet. Half of Russian exports are energy carriers, and sooner or later they will be squeezed out of Europe and flow to Asia, where Xi will decide how profitable this war is for him. The morality of international relations has not changed much since the meeting between Mao and Stalin in 1950. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. But this time it is far from the Kremlin dictating the terms of partnership to Beijing. Thanks you for watching this video. Remember, your support is highly incentivizing for us. We are also now on different platforms like Facebook and Instagram that you can check. See you next week.